Welcome back everyone. Today we're gonna be making a hooded scarf, and this is a remake of an older video. I wanted to go back, add some more detail and features to this pattern. And this is a super easy pattern for all skill levels. So if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the step-by-step instructions. And with all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna need 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a sweatshirt fleece, a Sherpa, or something that's a little bit thicker and warm. And I'm actually gonna be using a knit sweater fabric for my main fabric, and it's loosely woven. I thought it'd be fun to throw this fabric in and give it a try. Since it is loosely woven, I'm gonna be adding a thicker fabric on the inside. You'll need 1 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be a lighter weight fleece or even sweater fabric. And for my secondary fabric, I'm gonna be using a lighter weight sweatshirt fleece. This fabric combined with the sweater fabric, it's not too bulky and it should work perfectly. But you can use one fabric for the entire project, and if you choose to do this, you'll need 1.5 to 2 yards. But like always, get creative with it, test fabrics, try something new. You might find something that really works. You'll need 2 eyelets, and this is optional. If you choose to add the drawstring, you're gonna need these eyelets, and you can actually get them in any size. I recommend grabbing a kit. It comes with everything to install them in a bunch of different finishes. Going along with the eyelets, you'll need 1 yard of cord. This is gonna be for the drawstring. Realistically, you can use any type of cord, so find something that works with your fabric. You'll need 2 cord stoppers. This is also optional if you're adding the drawstring. It's just a nice little detail to add on at the end. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Before you start taping it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best results. From here, we're gonna cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting, you should end up with 4 scarf panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your secondary fabric. And for this project, you don't need to use 2 different fabrics. You can use the same fabric all the way around. But for my secondary fabric, which is going to be on the inside of the hood, I'm using a nice soft lightweight sweatshirt fleece. And for my main fabric on the outside, I'm going to be using a sweater knit. This is a very loosely woven fabric, but overall will look really nice on the outside. Moving on to the hood panel, you're going to need 4 in total. Feel free to cut them all out of the same fabric, just like the scarf panel, or cut 2 out of your main fabric and 2 out of your secondary fabric. And I'm going to be using the same fabrics I did for the scarf panel. Before we get started with the sewing, I just want to show how you can adjust the scarf panel, because you can actually adjust this to your preference by widening it or even lengthening it. To do this, you're going to want to adjust it at the bottom, so you're either going to want to widen it at the bottom and taper it up towards the top, and the same goes for the length. If you add length, just taper it a little bit wider or taper it in. But it really comes down to just making it once or twice to really get the feeling. Moving on to construction, we're going to lay our secondary fabric out with right sides pointing up and lay our main fabric over top so the right sides are together. And once you have both panels lined up correctly, we're going to sew around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. And before we get started, for this project, we're going to be using a serger. Sergers are great for stretchy knit fabrics. They're going to allow the fabric to stretch and the thread not to break. They also cut and clean up the edges as you're sewing. I highly recommend using a serger for this project, but if you don't have one, it's totally fine. I'm going to show you another method for sewing stretchy knit on your domestic sewing machine. Switch your machine to a zigzag stitch with the higher width and stitch length, and by doing this, it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. And either method works great, so choose what works best for you. And we're actually going to be using both machines for this project, because once we start sewing the hood, it can get a little bit bulky, and using a regular sewing machine can be a little bit better in those thick areas. And again, this really depends on what fabric you're using. If you're using heavier weight fabric, you're going to need to use both machines or just the one machine. But if you're using lighter weight fabric, you can pretty much get away with using a serger on this entire project. So all in all, it's nice to have both machines around. After finishing up the stitch, we're going to check both sides to make sure all the layers are sewn together, and then we're going to flip the right sides out through the opening at the top. Repeat this process for both of your scarf panels, and you may want to use a wooden dowel to poke out the corners at the bottom, or something long enough that you can reach those corners. Once you have the right sides out, we're going to move to the edges and we're going to add a top stitch all the way around, again avoiding the top opening. And I'm going to be adding this top stitch about 1/4 inch away from the outside edge, but realistically, you can add this stitch as far away from the edge as you want, or even feel free to add a decorative stitch. But this stitch does serve some purpose. It's going to hold those layers together so that way they're not twisting all around. And again, repeat this process for the opposite scarf panel. After finishing up the top stitching, we're going to place these panels off to the side and grab our hood panels. We will be using all of the panels, so grab both of your main fabric and both of your secondary fabric, or all of your fabric, whatever you're choosing to do. Starting with the secondary fabric, we're going to place them flat with the right sides pointing up. We're going to grab our main fabric and lay it directly over top, lining up the outside edges with right sides together. Place a few pins so nothing moves around, and we're going to start by sewing just the front edges at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, I'm using a serger. Feel free to use a serger or just a regular zigzag stitch. From here, we're going to grab one of the sides, doesn't matter which. We're going to open it up so the right sides are facing up and place the other side over top with right sides together. And make sure the secondary fabric lines up with the secondary fabric and the main fabric lines up with the main fabric. And we're going to stitch the top edge all the way around. I like to start directly at the top right on the seam, so that way it's perfectly lined up. Once you reach the bottom, we're going to go back to the top and sew in the opposite direction. You don't have to do it this way, I just found it makes it a little bit easier to keep that top seam lined up. Next, we're going to flip the right sides out and you should start to see the formation of the hood. And I always like to double check to make sure all the layers are stitched together. Sometimes you can miss a spot and it's easy to go back and finish it off at this point. Using the pattern as a guide, we're going to mark out where we want our eyelets. The eyelets are optional. If you're not adding them, you can skip ahead. An easy way to do this is to lay the pattern piece over the hood panel and to find out where the eyelet placement guide lands. When it comes to the actual eyelet, you can choose whatever size you like. I'm going to be using a little bit bigger, but you can buy kits that come with a bunch of different sizes, styles, finishes, and also the tools to install them. Once you decided on your eyelet, we're going to cut a little hole in our marked area and feed your eyelet through the hole. Remember, we're only doing this on the outside layer. We want this to be on the inside of our hood, so don't cut into your secondary fabric. And we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side of the hood, so I like to feel where the eyelet lies, cut a hole in that area, and feed your second eyelet through. The goal is to have them perfectly lined up, and I found this was an easy way of doing it. We're going to be using a hammer die. This is the easiest way to install them without buying a lot of tools. You simply feed it into the back of the eyelet and hammer it into position. Before hammering, if your eyelet did come with a back, place the back cover on and hammer until the inner eyelet edges are rolled to the bottom. It does take a decent amount of force, so don't be too light with the hammer. With both of the eyelets attached, we're going to flip the wrong sides back out. Make sure you have it still in the hood formation and not flat. For this next step, you're going to want your bottom edges perfectly lined up. Grab one of your complete scarf panels and you're going to want to locate the outside edge. This is going to be the edge that is tapered. We're going to face that edge so it points away from the hood panel and lines up with our front edge. With all that in mind, place the scarf panel in between both of the layers, making sure the layers are lined up with right sides together. And of course, the outside edge is facing in the correct direction. The top of the scarf panel should line up with the placement guide on the bottom of the hood panel. Also push the outside edge of the scarf panel up as far as you can so it's directly touching the front edge of the hood panel. When you have it into position, place a few pins so that way it doesn't move around, and we're going to flip to the opposite side and do the same thing. And the biggest thing to remember is to make sure you face the outside edge in the correct direction and push it as far as you can to the front edge of that hood panel. With both scarf panels aligned and pinned down, we're going to move towards the center and line up our center seam. Place a few pins along that entire bottom edge. When both sides are lined up and pinned down, we're going to stitch along that bottom edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance, but we're going to leave a gap in the middle so that way we can flip the right sides back out. And I am using a straight stitch for this one because there's a lot of layers where the scarf lies and I'm sure it's not going to snap when stretched. Once you reach the center area, I would jump about 2 to 4 inches, just enough so that way you can flip everything back out through the opening. Start the new stitch on the opposite side 1/4 inch away from the edge and go ahead and stitch all the way through. Those edges can be a bit bulky, so take your time. From here, we're going to find the opening and pull the right sides out. The bigger you leave the opening, the easier it is to pull out, but again, it's harder to actually stitch it back closed. At this point, you can start to see it really coming together, and we only have a few more steps before it's complete. Once again, find that opening, and since mine is a smaller opening, it's going to be a lot easier to seal off. The easiest way to do this is fold those layers in so the right sides are together. Place a few pins when the outside edges are lined up, and we're going to add a top stitch all the way along that bottom edge. I'll be adding my top stitch a 1/4 inch away from the outside edge to match my scarf panels. I typically like to keep my top stitching consistent throughout the project, so feel free to match what you used in previous steps. Moving on to the drawstring stitch, we're going to use the pattern as a reference and mark it out on both sides of our hood. The pattern is only a guide. The main thing you want to focus on is to make sure it's on the outside of your eyelet and lined up evenly all the way around the outside edge. And this is going to create a pathway for our drawstring and prevent it from flopping all around on the inside of those two panels. You'll want to start it directly at the base of the hood and finish up on the opposite base. I always like to double check it after stitching to make sure both sides are even. You can de-thread it and try it again if it didn't turn out great the first stitch. But moving on to the last step, and that's adding our drawstring. Feel free to use whatever cord you want. You can use parachute cord, regular cord. It's totally up to you and the look you're going for. And an easy way to feed it through is to attach something to the end of the drawstring. I'm using a paper clip. Most people will use a safety pin. I just didn't have one at the moment, and I found that a paper clip works just as good. You want something hard so you can feel it and kind of push it through that pathway. I will say the quickest technique is using a thin metal rod that you can push all the way through and it's out in a second. But again, I didn't have that laying around. Feel free to use that, paper clip, safety pin, whatever works best for you. Pull out the drawstrings to your desired length and snip the ends. I'm going to be adding a couple cord stoppers. This is optional. To add them, just push the button and feed your drawstring through. And lastly, to finish it off, we're going to add a knot at the end of the cord. This will prevent the cord stopper from sliding off, but I always like to add a little bit of extra detail into these drawstrings. So I cut a small piece of leather, notched it out in the middle, and this is going to fold over the end of the drawstring, ultimately covering up that raw edge. With both sides of the leather cap lined up, I'm going to add a double-sided rivet to secure it down. And if you do this method, the rivet will go through your drawstring. This is just an extra little detail I added on. I made it up in the moment. So definitely get creative with it. Use what you have laying around and make it look nice. If you choose to do this, depending on the cord you're using, you may want to add a stitch at the bottom to prevent any of that fraying from coming out. And like always, the final step is adding your branding, and your hooded scarf is complete. I just use branded pieces of leather and attach them with double-sided rivets. This is an easy and quick way to go. And after finishing this project, you can see how long the scarf panel is. So if you do make this in the future, you can adjust it and really perfect it to your custom measurements. You can also add pockets in the bottom of the scarf panel for your hands to slide into. There's just a lot of fun things you can do with this pattern to really make it your own.
And that's going to do it for your hooded scarf. Hopefully you had a good time with this pattern. It's a super simple pattern and it's very easy to customize. So definitely make a few of them, share them with your friends, test out different fabrics. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. I'm going to keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.